requests a recording. There it is. And I also want to apologize. I understand that there's some issues with the closed captioning that we're working on. So I do apologize if you're not able to see those. And if you miss anything, maybe just chat the Trua person in the link. Bennett is on Trua headquarters. Just chat and he'll be able to tell you whatever it was that maybe went by. So I want to talk for a minute about why we decided to start Emor. As many of you know, the right wing, both in the secular world and also the Jewish world, has invested really significantly in thought leadership over many decades. So in the secular world, that's organizations like the Cato Institute or the Federalist Society or other think tanks like that. And in the Jewish space, we have institutions like the Maimonides Fund and the Tikva Fund that do really significant work in media, in publication, in fellowships for every possible group that one could think of. And those are groups, and there's some others, but those are the two major ones. And those groups are claiming Jewish authenticity for what are fundamentally conservative ideas. And they're doing it by first building on fear, by drawing on people's fear and suggesting that in fact, Judaism supports a very narrow-minded view of the world that does not include trying to build a more just world for all of us. Tikva, for example, says that what it's teaching is conservatism and American exceptionalism. And they say that they are the authentic Jews and often actively try to undermine the Jewish social justice world and Jewish social justice leaders by dismissing us as inauthentic or not sufficiently grounded in Jewish text. But we know that Jewish tradition includes thousands of years of very smart people trying to figure out how to build a just society that reflects the divine presence. And so we know that in fact, Jewish texts asks big questions about how do we make sure that nobody is poor? How do we make sure that everybody is treated with dignity? How do we actually how do we create a society that cares for the health and well-being of everybody in it? Those are hard questions. And we have thousands of years of wisdom, both text and history and other kinds of writings and art that can help us to respond to these major questions. And so we in Emor are going to dive very deep into Jewish text and history and wisdom to respond to the major questions of our moment in a way that also compels us to action. So this is not just about talking and ideas and living up here in the ivory tower. It's about ideas that then can compel us to take the next step. We know that words create worlds. We know that language defines what people care about, how different positions are understood, whether we act out of fear or out of hope. And so we are building Emor to create worlds through words that are based in Judaism and that are based in a commitment to human rights and to justice and to the dignity of every single human being. We also hope that Emor will be a resource for the broader Jewish social justice field. I will say that I am speaking to you from the Hill International Office where I'm here. I was just at a day-long meeting of the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable, which is 78 organizations that are committed to justice. And I was able to share with the CEOs here that we're launching Emor, and they were just incredibly excited because this is something that everybody says, we need this. All of us need the intellectual underpinnings for our work. So I just want to share that excitement fresh from the other CEOs of the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. We know that many of you on this call have already made very generous gifts in support of Emor. I want to especially acknowledge the generosity of Max Yappy, Mark Gross, and Susan Oxhorn, Ann Germanicos, and Sarah and Andrew Litt, whose lead gifts have made it possible for us to get Emor off the ground. So this is a preview call. Emor's formal launch is in 2 days on Thursday, so I will trust everybody to help us keep it a secret until Thursday. And for those of you who are in New York, we will be celebrating that launch with a Torah procession through Lower Manhattan, starting at Battery Park and culminating outside City Hall, where we will visit various important historical sites in New York to literally bring the sacred words of Jewish wisdom and tradition to these important places as a way of speaking together about justice, about civil discourse, and about governance. So if you are in New York and have some flexibility, let us know in the chat or with email. We still have a few spots and we would love to have you join us. And in the meantime, I am really happy to introduce Rabbi Lev Meyerowitz Nelson to share a bit about one of Emor's first projects and to introduce this morning's guest teacher. Lev has been at TRA for 9 years. Since the morning after his ordination from Hebrew College in Boston, it's true, he drove out that morning to our board meeting, our board retreat. And in addition to his role as TRA's Director of Leadership and Learning, he's serving now as the Director of Emor, and also you will have an opportunity soon to meet Rabbi Becky Jay, a recent graduate of Hebrew Union College in New York, who is also going to be working with Emor. So I'm very excited now to introduce Lev to you.
Thanks so much, Jill. Emor is going to be tackling many different topics that are important to us as North American Jews. And one of the first is Israel. Too often I find our thinking on Israel is a decade or more out of date. So we find ourselves over here rehashing old debates while the situation on the ground has moved on. We want Emor to help us get out of that pattern by offering fresh ideas and new paradigms that will challenge the old zero-sum approaches we often take for granted. That's how our project called the Threefold Chord came into being. We wanted to ask how democracy, nationalism, which is to say Zionism, and human rights can coexist in the Jewish state in the 21st century. Those three terms, which braid together into this threefold chord, are each something we often take for granted and think we understand, but there's complexity to each of them: democracy, nationalism, and human rights. And when they interact with each other, they can create effects that we didn't necessarily anticipate or wish for. Back in the spring, we convened a roundtable of 9 scholars to start discussing the question and pointing directions for new research and thinking. Later this fall, we plan to publish the first of what will be a series of papers that emerge from that conversation. In the meanwhile, I want to introduce you to one of our roundtable participants. We'll take you behind the curtain and show you some of what he's been thinking about in the course of this project. Ezra Tzfadia is a senior fellow at Indiana University's Center for the Study of the Middle East. He earned his PhD at the Friedrich Alexander University of Erlangen-Nuremberg in Germany, with a dissertation entitled Theocracy in Shia Islam and Judaism, Studies in Legal Theology. He's also worked hands-on in the world of foreign policy, doing some work related to Iran and also serving as J Street's New York field director in 2014 and 2015. I'm delighted that we get a chance to share Ezra and some of his work with you today. He'll teach for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll pause for some questions and discussion. As you think of questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and I'll queue them up for Ezra when he's ready for them. Ezra, take it away.
So thank you so much, Lev and Jill. I'm really thrilled to participate. And as the rabbis say, teach some Torah. So the webinar we had in the spring with the 9 other scholars got me thinking about academic literature on right-wing populism, which is intimately connected with who belongs and doesn't in the notion of we the people. And that's connected to the notion of Am Yisrael, the Jewish nation, or our own version of we the people. So in the academy, political theorists say that liberals need to be concerned about establishing a distinct vision of the people to counteract right-wing populism, one defined by both distinct group membership, yet also a moral duty to others, universal, based on human rights. The exchange with the Emor team on how to precisely define and how to intellectually counteract right-wing Jewish populism was robust, and not without debate and disagreement, something that defines the inner workings of any think tank really, especially a new one. But an important current emerged: the necessity for engaging with all the visions of Jewish peoplehood, Am Yisrael, expressed in modernity, especially those who wrestled with and articulated Zionism through these really rich visions of liberal Judaism. We see all these people with streets named after them in Israel, without realizing that each of these figures had distinct and often competing notions of we the people, Am Yisrael, and the consequences for articulating the basis for Zionism in their age. The Zionist congresses in the turn of the 20th century and all the intellectual activity surrounding them was in many ways a constitutional convention, with intellectual outputs surrounding them that we should really consider a version of the Federalist Papers. One vision especially stood out as potentially quite relevant for today: especially for a think tank like Emor, aimed at cultivating intellectual leadership animated by the moral imperative lying at the core of Judaism. And that person is Asher Greenberg, but you probably know him best as Echad Ha'am. He lived from 1856 to 1927, moving between his native Ukraine and London, eventually settling in Palestine in 1920. I'll get to his biography in a bit, but it's important to note that for a while, his vision was the leading alternative to the three visions that seem to have won out following Israel's establishment as the Jewish state. And I'll highlight just briefly three of these visions, and then we'll dive into Echad Ha'am. And so the first, you probably all know his name, Theodor Herzl, a Central European from Vienna, whose political Zionism took the form of Western and Central European nationalism. He was reacting to European anti-Semitism, seeing that anti-Semitism as a failure of Enlightenment liberalism. If Am Yisrael would just have their state, just like the British or the French, they could be part of a liberal collective of world nations, and anti-Semitism would be solved. Herzl is widely acknowledged, he wasn't very much concerned about Judaism. And David Ben-Gurion took up this mantle, albeit making with a socialist spin. The second is Rav Kook, who lived from 1865 to 1935. He was a former chief rabbi of Palestine during the British Mandate, also coming from the Ukraine. And he's now recognized as the ideological godfather of religious Zionism. For him, Am Yisrael was a mystically sacred people imbued with the spirit of divine. And the implantation of Am Yisrael into the Holy Land would be something that could bring about the Messianic age. And the third vision that I'll outline that was contemporaneous to Echad Ha'am was Vladimir Jabotinsky, who lived from 1880 to 1940. The intellectual godfather of the present-day Likud party and previously the Irgun. For him, Am Yisrael is a superior ethnic group, superior because its diasporic experience amongst multiple nations of the world would lead it to learn from their civilizational contributions, and they develop a sort of toughness and a national will from all the suffering that was inflicted on them. Am Yisrael is like all the other nations of the world with a will to power, and that can express itself in the founding of a Jewish state in Palestine. He was an ardent capitalist, so not a fan of the kibbutzim. And in the language of political theory, you can say he's Thomas Hobbes meets Friedrich Nietzsche. So now let's turn to Echad Ha'am, who's often called the agnostic rabbi and prophet, who caught the imagination of the early Zionist congresses and was Herzl's main rival. So Echad Ha'am, like I said, was born in the Ukraine to a Hasidic family that was economically wealthy, but also learned. So in the Hasidic world, that's practically royalty. He was considered a Talmudic genius growing up in the yeshiva who would eventually rebel. He left the ghetto to embrace secular studies in Russian, while also engaging with the Hebrew language Enlightenment movement of Eastern Europe. He abhorred the kind of Slavic nationalism which surrounded him in Eastern Europe's capitals, whose racial superiority model he considered paradigmatic for all nationalisms, all ethnic nationalisms. So he saw none of the liberal potential of Herzl that Herzl saw within Central Western European nationalism and Enlightenment. So this produced an intellectual vision for Echad Ha'am. That was a vision for Am Yisrael and Zionism that was simultaneously realist and utopian. It was religious in many ways, but also agnostic. Echad Ha'am didn't believe in God. His primary goal was to inculcate a Jewish nationhood based on a unique moral spirit defining Am Yisrael, one that lies at the root of its chosenness. If other nations have a will to power, then Jews have a will to morality. a vision, as we will see, Echad Ha'am believed lay at the core of rabbinic Judaism and was transferred throughout the generation. So you see, he was wrestling with Friedrich Nietzsche. That will to power is a discourse that none of the figures in early Zionism could escape. So unlike Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of the Reconstructionist Judaism, who had a very similar intellectual vision of Jewish civilization emerging from Jewish culture's great texts, he would not dispense with a concept of Jewish chosenness. So even if there is no God, the Jewish people were still chosen for their moral spirit. Even though anti-Semitism is irredeemable, despite Jews' best efforts, they nevertheless must maintain a commitment to humanity, a prelude to what I view as a human rights argument for Jews today. Even if we're confronted with anti-Semitism, we nonetheless have a commitment to humanity. Am Yisrael exists to protect and dynamize Judaism. It orients the Jewish individual beyond the perpetual material need for his own survival at one extreme, or a will to accumulate money and power in an opportunistic way on the other. He had a vision of the synagogue morphing into a Beit Midrash, a house of learning, dispensing with liturgy and prayers to promote the study of Jewish culture at all levels. So for the rabbis in the room, the Pardes model, from the simple meaning to the midrashic meaning to the secret meaning, but secularized. The Jewish intellectual in his vision is the secularized Hasidic tzaddik. He bridges this transgenerational national moral spirit of Am Yisrael with the demands of Am Yisrael in its particular age. His explicitly political Zionism was minimalist. He wanted to focus intently on Jewish protection, whether that be under the Ottoman or British Empire, or with Jews being in control of its own state. He really vacillated on this question of statehood. And unlike the capitalism of Jabotinsky and Herzl or the socialism of Ben-Gurion, Echad Ha'am articulates no real economic vision other than a trenchant critique of material striving for power, for money. And I'll end with saying that for Echad Ha'am, it's the Jewish Yeshuv or the Zionist Olim's treatment of the Palestinians, which can put his moral theory of the national spirit of Am Yisrael to a real test. So I've picked 3 meaty quotes from Echad Ha'am's different essays that can hopefully inspire your questions and reflect his vision. I'd love for us all to think about the applicability of Echad Ha'am's vision for the present day when Jews are trying to negotiate the relationship between Judaism, human rights, and democracy. What can an institutionalized endeavor like Emor, which aims at thought leadership, glean or maybe not glean from Echad Ha'am's vision? In addition to these questions, which I'll pose, of course, I'd like to answer any other questions you may have. So Lev, do you want to bring up the slides? So with this first quote, which in an essay called The Jewish Problem and the Jewish State, Echad Ha'am is trying to create a notion of Am Yisrael that embraces the nation instead of nationalism. So he writes, a political ideal which is not grounded in our national culture is apt to seduce us from loyalty to our own inner spirit and to beget in us a tendency to find the path of glory in the attainment of material power and political dominion, thus breaking the thread which unites us with the past and undermining our historical foundation. Chibat Zion, the love of Zion, and the name of Echad Ha'am's political faction within the Zionist congresses, looks to a Jewish state only to provide a secure refuge for Judaism and a cultural bond to unite our nation. Chibat Zion begins with the national culture because only through the national culture and for its sake can a Jewish state be established in such a way as to correspond with the will and needs of the Jewish people. So it seeks to return to its historic center, where it will be able to live a life developing in a natural way, to bring its powers into play in every department of human culture, to broaden and perfect those national possessions which it has acquired up to now, and thus contribute to the common stock of humanity in the future as it has in the past, a great national culture. It does not need an independent state, but only the creation in its own native land of conditions favorable to its development. So out of this quote, what I think we see Echad Ha'am is doing is articulating a vision of Am Yisrael that rejects the political ideal of power at its guiding principle. Instead, pointing to both physical refuge and the revitalizing of Jewish culture in his vision of Zionism. A Jewish state has a very specific purpose: the protection of Judaism and the enablement of the Jewish moral spirit in both the land of Israel and the diaspora. With this in place, Jews and Judaism can take the rightful place amongst the nations of the world and contribute to humanity. So the question that I have percolating in my mind in response to this, and maybe you'll share some of your views, is can a really minimalistic position towards power politics as only required for the bare necessities actually contribute to a functional political vision today, especially following the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel and the amassing of considerable political power by Jews in America. So the second quote, which Lev can, how am I doing on time?
We've probably got like 10, 12 minutes left.
Oh, okay. So can you bring up the second quote?
Yep.
So, as I said before, Echad Ha'am has this vision of Am Yisrael as this unique nation amongst the nations who does not have a will to power, but a national spirit aiming at a moral vision. And he sees the rabbinic founding of Am Yisrael as a Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests in Yavne, following the destruction of the Second Temple as his vision. And I'll talk a little bit after the quote what he meant by that. So he writes in this famous essay, Flesh and Spirit, Judaism was compelled to find an answer to the problem of collective life. It had to endow the life of the community with a purpose sufficiently large to sustain the morale of the individual, even when his personal life was a burden to him. Hence, the community of Israel became a kingdom of holy priests and a holy nation. Mamlechet Kohanim veGoy Kadosh, from the book of Exodus, destined from the very beginning to be a moral example to the whole of mankind through its Torah. So, like I said, this quote references a famous verse in Exodus, and I will make you a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, sort of one of the core biblical citations for a vision of the Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, as chosen. In this essay, Echad Ha'am really focuses on the emergence of rabbinic Judaism in the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple and the end of Jewish political rule by actual priests. And of course, at this time, we have Christianity, which also emerges as the chief competitor for Judaism and the Jews. And Echad Ha'am emphasizes that Rabban Gamliel creates in the town of Yavne in the Galilee a text and learning-based Talmudic culture which it derives out of the moral mission of the prophets in these initial centuries after the destruction of the temple. And in this environment of Yavne, the rabbinic Mishnah emerges and later the Palestinian Talmud. this unique moral and textual cultural vision of nationhood that's founded at that time can be transported into the diaspora via the Kehillah, the Jewish community in exile over 1,000 years. This is a Kehillah in which individual Jews suffered, but nonetheless often resisted conversion to Christianity. In modern times, with the fall of the walls of the ghetto, there is the need for a national home in Eretz Yisrael, not only to provide Jewish protection against anti-Semitism, but to sustain the national spirit as reflected in its moral identity, following the secularism of enlightenment in the diaspora, something that's very tempting for Jews and might lead to the abandonment of their Judaism. So my question is, do you think Echad Ha'am's political vision can survive without a theology, without God? Are the constructs of national spirit and Jewish moral election over the other nations of the world viable or even morally justified anymore in our present day? And so the final quote that I took from Echad Ha'am.
Sorry to interrupt. I wonder if you want to touch on, are you open to a couple of questions on the quotes we've done so far before we move on?
Sure.
We had two that I thought were really insightful. One about chosenness and kind of how Echad Ha'am fits in with Buber. Why don't we start there? How do you see that relationship?
Oh, between Echad Ha'am and Martin Buber?
Kind of in the realm of Jewish nationalism.
So I think Buber really builds off of Echad Ha'am, but with a readiness not to give up Jewish belief and Jewish theology. And Buber as someone who is really reacting to the emergence of Jewish power in the land in Palestine that's reflected through his political writings. Buber was animated, by the sort of spirit of Hasidism, by interpretation of the Bible. And so I see him as sort of the religious alternative to Mordechai Kaplan, both building off of Echad Ha'am's vision. So we don't need an agnostic rabbi anymore with Buber.
Great. And then a question from Max about how we work with these 19th century thinkers who were formed in this age of empires, when we've seen through the hindsight of history all the dangers that arose from that milieu. Can you extract the thinker from the context?
So that's really an excellent question, especially as today. So racism, nationalism are very much ascendant today, and back then those paradigms were not already discredited by liberal thinking. The thinkers back then, I think, felt much more of an imperative to take on a lot of those categories into their own thought. And I think we can look back at them with an understanding of the constructs to which they were perhaps politically beholden, and also imagine these figures, what would they say in response to our contemporary reality, post-Holocaust, post the emergence of the Jewish state, the establishment of sort of a liberal order post-World War II in the international community. But then again, also to see them in the context of the ethno-national, the sort of racist nationalism, populism that's been emerging in the last 20 years. So I think it's the job of us as intellectuals and thinkers of our own vision to assess what can we take, what can we transform, how do we imagine our minds meeting theirs.
Thanks. All right, let's go to the third quote.
So Echad Ha'am amongst these early Zionist thinkers very much clearly saw the human rights problem and the moral quandary or challenge facing Am Yisrael in its arrival in the land of Israel, with Palestinians already living there. And so he writes, this is a fairly early essay of his. We should be caught after a first trip to the Zionist Yishuv in Palestine. We should be cautious in our dealings with the foreign people among whom we return to live, to handle these people with love and respect, and needless to say, with justice and good judgment. And what do our brothers do? Exactly the opposite. They were slaves in their diasporas, and suddenly they find themselves with unlimited freedom, wild freedom that only a country like Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, can offer. This sudden change has planted despotic tendencies in their heart, as always happens to former slaves. And he quotes Proverbs 30:22, Eved ki imloch. This is what happens when a slave becomes a king. They deal with the Arabs with hostility and cruelty, trespass unjustly, beat them shamefully for no sufficient reason, and even boast about their actions. There is no one to stop the flood and put an end to this despicable and dangerous tendency. Our brothers indeed were right when they said that the Arab only respects he who exhibits bravery and courage. But when these people feel that the law is on their rival's side, and even more so, if they are right to think that their rival's actions are unjust and oppressive, even if they are silent and endlessly reserved, they keep their anger in their hearts. And these people, the native Palestinians, will be revengeful like no other. This essay, A Truth from Eretz Yisrael. And so what I'm wrestling with in this quote is whether this notion of the Jewish people as being slaves who come to rule still an operable concept. In Proverbs, this is one of the three conditions that the Proverbs say the earth trembles in fear in front of. And so I want to think, how does the Jewish experience of the Holocaust feed into this? Because you can hear that slave becomes king rhetoric in much anti-Israel critique today. And the other question I have is, should Echad Ha'am's uniqueness amongst the Zionist founders in identifying the Palestinian question as a moral one necessarily elevate him above others for our purposes? In Emor.
Thanks so much, Ezra. Give folks a moment to formulate questions as we get ready to shift gears. Max is a follow-up here about maintaining national spirit and what you think that means, especially in the context today of having national political power.
Right, I think our vision today is the negotiation of the political power with what Rabbi Jacobs identified earlier as a moral spirit, an ethical vision, deeply embedded within our textual tradition over the course of millennia. And we need to examine whether and how the assumption of political power can actually enhance a unique Jewish national spirit based in morality, through a clear assessment of what the dangers are when one engages in politics and questions of power. You need to remember, Echad Ha'am's vision was not the successful one at the end of the day. He was the utopian, even if a lot of his elements were considered quite realist. Arthur Hertzberg, the great scholar of Zionism, called Theodor Herzl the utopian and Echad Ha'am the realist in many ways. The messianist utopian versus the agnostic rabbi realist. So I think this is an emerging a conversation we can really have, thinking about why Echad Ha'am failed, how we can resurrect his vision, tinker or conceptually wrestle with problematic elements that are not politically effective in our present day. But to close, I just really think that we need to engage with our founding fathers in a sense. And actually, when we look at street names in Israel, know that there's an alternative reality that many of them would have envisioned.
Thanks so much. And hopefully we'll get some founding mothers in there too. I'm going to
right.
shift gears now from sharing with you some of the content Emor has been playing with to some of what that looks like in the world. And to do that, I'm going to introduce my colleague and co-conspirator, Rabbi Becky Jay, who's Emor's program manager. So as Jill said, Becky was ordained this year at HUC here in New York. Before going to rabbinical school, Becky earned a master's in religious studies from Yale, and amid a number of other professional experiences, she spent 2 years in China setting up the Yale China program. So after an ordeal like that, we figured starting a new Jewish think tank here in New York City would be a breeze for her. I'm so glad to have Becky as my teammate. She's going to take you on a brief tour of the new Emor website and tell you about some of the other projects we have cooking up and launching in the next few weeks.
Hi, everyone. It is so lovely to be here with you today. And thank you, Ezra, for sharing with us. I love that idea that you had brought to the table, which I think Emor does beautifully, bringing minds to meet minds. And hopefully, as you'll see, our website, I've never been so proud of a website in my whole life. It does that and embodies the intentionality with which that we're just trying to have these very difficult conversations and in it for the long run to find maybe at one point in the future an answer. So dun, 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 dun. This is very exciting. Welcome to our Emor website, which is it is our space of gathering and intentional conversation and discussion and safe disagreement. It is a place where we will come together to share thoughts, to share our words, and to look at Jewish sources and utilize different tools to have these discussions with each other and to broaden our community and broaden our sense of action. And so this is actually our homepage. And as you can see, we say welcome, and we have the definition of Emor in Hebrew. We are bringing together from all of the corners of the Jewish community a space to ask big questions, study Jewish texts, and hold courageous conversations about today's most important moral and political issues. And as we move down, we have some of our guiding principles, a lovely letter from our director, and we also have our critical conversations that will over time populate with different resources, including webinars, including different tools that we are ideating about now, so that we can involve as many people as we can in these important conversations and ensure that we're all having the same discussion. This is actually a personal favorite of mine. What topics are on your mind? And it's because very few times do we really get we as members of Jewish community always get to contribute what we wish, what we think is important. And so we allow people and invite people to join the conversation and shape where our conversations are going, what we're talking about, who we're talking about, and who's having these conversations. So now I will take you actually to our About page and let you for about a minute just read over what we have here. And with our vision, we also include our values, the tenets by which we will speak to each other, by which we will communicate with each other, the tenets by which we will act in solidarity with one another. And we hope that people will take to these values, but also feel empowered to utilize them, adopt them, and also maybe over time change them with us in different ways. And one of those ways is through our Emor bookshelf. The Emor bookshelf is an online resource that we're offering to community members, where every month there will be a contributor contributing a book not written by them, but written by someone else, and why they think that this book speaks to the moment in time that they are addressing. It can be this political moment, it can be this moment globally, it can be this religious moment. And we figured that it would be a really nice way of learning from each other on different levels. So as you can see, for instance, our first contributor is Rabbi Hilly Haber. Please don't tell anyone until Thursday, though. And we have Rabbi Haber's contribution, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And so when we click Read More, we have Rabbi Haber's take on this book and why it is important in this moment. And we were hoping that the different layers of perspective would be able to really appeal and also invite people to join the conversations that we're having on every different level. So minds meeting minds, wherever your mind's at, we'll meet Hilly, or you can meet James Cone if you want, the theologian. But you can meet both of them in our bookshelf. And hopefully over time, as we accumulate books, we're hoping that Bizrat Hashem in 3 years' time, 10 years' time, 30 years' time, or more, we'll be able to have interviews and perhaps webinar series where we bring these people together and say, what do you think of this book now? Does this book speak to our history? Does this book speak to our time? And we really hope that it will just create a legacy of learning that people can feel empowered to utilize at their own pace, and lift the words of others and create a culture of lifting words of others and truly reading them and truly hearing them, which is why we also have a glossary. We realize that we sometimes are having different conversations, even when we're using the same words or speaking in the same language. And so what Emor wanted to do was create a glossary so that we could ensure we were having the same conversation or as close to in the safest space that we could we can evolve in and that we could disagree in. So we have some of our glossary entries here. And you can see that we have defined them according to Emor's terms, but we are also welcoming folks to join the conversation and have some discussion about what these glossary terms mean, how they impact different people, and how they change the conversations we're having. And lastly, we're actually going to go to a conversation page. So we have conversations right over here, and we're moving to freedom. So this is one of our topics pages, our conversation pages. Freedom is one aspect of Emor that we will be focusing on throughout our learning together. And as you can see, to plug, we already have our first event, Reclaiming Freedom, which will be a webinar with Professor Libby Anchor about her book, Ugly Freedoms, on October 19th. It's very easy to register, as you can see. And so on Thursday, I hope we all click on this link right over here. And in addition to this webinar, we will also be hosting a call for submissions for a zine that we are very, very excited about, so that we can also branch out into speaking different languages, not just with words, but with art and different media, and listen and see and learn of the different ways that people are communicating with each other and having conversations about the world around them through Judaism and through their lived experiences. Lev?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Becky. We can get rid of the screen share now. And in our last few minutes, we have about 10 or so minutes. If people have general questions about Emor or ideas or just excitement you want to share, we're here for that. So drop it in the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you. Love to hear what's bubbling up for you. Let's also kill this spotlight. There we go. We could also use this time for more questions for Ezra, if that's kind of where your head is at.
I have a question for y'all, if you don't mind. So many issues that you could bring words to and conversation to. And I'm curious how you choose what to focus on right now, given this particular moment, you know, which continually is changing, but has so much urgency.
What I would say is two things. One is kind of drawing from the core values and the core issues that Shura works on, and kind of exploring them in new directions and with different audiences. So that's why Israel is on the table as a starting point. And two is, I think, what's kind of in the zeitgeist and what we think, where we think Jewish texts and Jewish community can join a conversation or offer something new. So freedom, for instance, we're seeing so much of that rhetoric on the right, and you know, freedom is also a Jewish value. Pesach, we have an entire 8-day holiday. It's all about freedom, and so we wanted to bring those voices into the conversation and just make space for for Jews to stand on our own 2 feet, on our own texts, and not just be swamped by kind of the dominant American conversation. And we'll be adding more topics as kind of we gather steam. Jill, do you want to add anything to that?
Thanks, Lev. Yeah, we spent a lot of time thinking about what the most crucial topics were. What are the questions that emerge over and over? What are the things that some of the right is using fear to talk to people about? And some of the questions, certainly this question that Ezra taught about Israel and democracy, right? This threefold cord, and that came up all over the place. And this question of freedom, because freedom often in this country is talked about as individual freedoms, like I have the freedom to carry my gun into the public space. But of course, that kind of freedom, often sometimes the way that we talk about freedoms infringes on other people's freedom. Like I have the freedom, I should have the right not to get shot when I'm going grocery shopping. And so we thought about some of these questions that come up, other things that came up, the family, because that's another term that the right has sometimes claimed and shouldn't be able to claim. So we have a very long list. We'll be working through it from now until eternity. And we definitely would love feedback if any of you all feel like here's something that people are talking about a lot in my community, wherever I sit. We definitely want to hear that. And things will develop as we go forward.
To the 2 questions in the chat, Nancy, yeah, we certainly see the work of Emor as trying to shift US policy in the long run. We're taking here the motto that politics is downstream from culture. So when we shift the culture and shift the language that people use to talk about the issues, we open up new possibilities and new ways of imagining and thinking that the present discourse wouldn't have even had a space to hold. So it's definitely a long game. When there's breaking news and rapid response, you'll still see Tra doing that, not Emor. Emor is going to have its eyes focused on the long term and what are the ideas and the conversations that we need to be injecting into the public discourse in order to move our society. And to Elaine's question, we absolutely see it as a gathering point. I'm not sure about moving it to action per se. Certainly, we want Emor's conversations to be a springboard for action. This isn't meant to be a sort of ivory tower, just thinking for thinking's sake. But the training component of our work is probably going to continue to live with Trua. So a little bit of both there.
I want to just add something. So we have, like I said, we have a very long wish list, and I just want to share a couple of things that are on our wish list that we don't yet have funding for. I can't sit here and tell you, oh, we're going to do this tomorrow or in 6 months, but just so you know what's on our wish list. So one, something that we heard in the process of putting this, of putting Emor together, we did a lot of focus groups. We did a lot of surveying, just online surveys, but we also did focus groups, including with students on campus. And we pulled from students who are super involved in Hillel, students who would never set foot in Hillel, students who just are coming in with all sorts of students at big public universities, students at small liberal arts universities, colleges. We tried to get a range. And something that we heard is that they are very confused about everything. And they feel like, particularly Israel, but lots of other things, they feel like they have to have all of their political positions 100% set before they can certainly step foot in the Jewish world. And there's not a real place to explore. And what there is, I know I've mentioned Tikva a lot, but there's the Tikva Fellowship for college students and high school and middle school and academics and just lots of fellowships. And so certainly one of our fantasies is to pull together cohorts, probably starting with college, but maybe later Jewish journalists or other kinds of formations, certainly academics, other kinds of formations of critical groups of members of the Jewish community who perhaps would enjoy having that kind of space to dig really deep, to grapple with big issues in a space that is at its core devoted to justice and also devoted to real exploration. And then the other thing is that we're also thinking about videos. Something else that we heard a lot from educators is, I'm super stressed out, I have no time, and an hour before my class or maybe 5 minutes before my class, I'm Googling for a video about whatever the topic is, and I'm finding videos from PragerU, which if you don't know it, it's like an inch away from QAnon. I'm just finding a lot of these kind of explainer videos that are coming out of the right, and we would like for there to be those kinds of videos that people will find Emor explaining things and talking about things in a way that is more intellectually honest. So that's just a little bit of our fantasy list. And again, happy to hear all of your thoughts or to talk to any of you more about that.
Great. I want to go to Julianne for our last question or comment.
First of all, thank you. This sounds like a really amazing project, and I hope to be a part of it conversationally and in other ways, both personally, just as a member of the Jewish community, but also like in capacity through USCJ and the Rabbinical Assembly. That being said, I have just, I guess, a sort of tachlis question. Difficult conversations are difficult. So, and when the point is to be able to have voices sort of meet each other and have minds meet each other, the intention is obviously to be able to like have dialogue and conversation where there are disparate views that are with some level of open-mindedness, but with a lens of justice. All that being said, it's very easy for people to frame things as justice oriented and not be interested in mutuality or like the same sort of political motivations, even if different ideologies. So are the frameworks sort of like we're going to develop it as we go? Is there something that is sort of like a group rules for whose voices, how that gets selected, who's uplifted, just sort of like that framework to make sure that the conversations remain true to the point without, I know it's not really First Amendment, I mean free speech because it's not government, but like that kind of, without getting shut down and getting stepped on by people saying that.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. We don't have guidelines or kind of a protocol for that in writing yet, but it's definitely a lens that we're bringing to this. I don't think we want, like, we want to be bringing in a diversity of voices kind of from the center across to the left. We don't feel like we need to be offering the right another platform for their ideas. They have plenty of their own platforms. And yeah, I think there's a lot we have to learn about how to have conversations with each other. And that's definitely something, you know, having messed that up before, it's definitely something that's on our minds and we want to make sure we get right. Jill or Becky, do either of you want to add to that?
I would love to. Yes, having safe and equitable conversations is definitely something that we aspire to do with a deep sense of humility as well, knowing that there are just going to be, for instance, definitions in our glossary that may not always land in ways that are keeping up with our changing world and have impact in that way. And so in that way, it will keep us on our toes for sure. But that is why we are asking for people to work with us and truly collaborate in a sacred way so that we can minimize, but also not just minimize that impact because we know that it exists, but also so that we can increase the voices that we're lifting, whether they be through media in other form or through spoken word or written word. And so it is one thing that we have been very, very intentional about. I invite transparency about it because I think it's very, yes, we invite transparency and these hard conversations because we really believe that this will make a change. And based on Dolly Chug's like failing upwards, if that makes sense, we are so excited to fail upwards, but we know we will go up and we will fail. And that is a part of what any new organization does and any new project does. So we're excited and we welcome any feedback that you may have so that we can make that picture of who is speaking and when they're speaking as easy and diverse as possible.
Great. So I'm going to wrap us up because we are at the hour. Be on the lookout for the big announcement email on Thursday when Shura goes live into the world. And then please tell all your friends, put it on social media, tell the world. I'm going to flag for you 2 upcoming events you'll want to put on your calendar. The first is the webinar that Becky mentioned earlier. On Wednesday, October 19th, we'll be hosting Professor Elizabeth Anker of George Washington University about her book, Ugly Freedoms, and what the idea of freedom means in Judaism. And then on Thursday, November 10th, join us for Hope in 2022 with Dr. David Arno. It'll be 2 days after the midterm elections, and regardless of how that turns out, we'll all be in need of some deep grounding and guidance of the role hope can play in our public lives. Both of the information for the registration information is on the website, and you'll be seeing them in your inbox as well. Finally, a reminder about Thursday, if you're here in New York and want to join us for the Torah procession in Lower Manhattan, and it doesn't rain, we'd love to have you, so feel free to chat me or email afterwards. In closing, I want to thank Ezra Tzfadia for teaching today. I want to thank our closed captioner for help making this webinar more accessible. All the Trust staff who worked on this with us, including Bennett Decker, Shira Danan, Jesse Kiriev, Rabbi Becky J, and Ronit Shlam. The music you heard playing at the start of the program was Speak by Janae Aiko. Finally, thanks to all of you for spending this hour with us. We really look forward to having you along for the ride as Emor goes out into the world. Take care. Have a good afternoon.